Hello class and welcome to week 1, chapter 1 for CIS 210. We will be reviewing this week's chapters, chapter 1 and 2. I'll do each chapter in a separate video, and I'll do the same thing for the subsequent weeks. So this week is fairly light in terms of chapters. Most other weeks, except for week 8, have 3 chapters. So I think that this will be a useful aid to you as you navigate through the material. Mind you, this is not to be a substitute for reading the textbook. I still expect that you will take the time to read each chapter thoroughly and then use this to sort of supplement or further cement your understanding of what you've read. Some of these slide decks are rather long. This one, for example, tonight is 54 slides. I can't promise that I'll spend a lot of time on each slide. In fact, my objective is to spend about 30 minutes reviewing the slide deck with you. I'll also make the slide deck available for your download, and you can review it at your leisure. I think the slide decks are an excellent way to study for the chapter quizzes. That, in conjunction with the reading that you're doing, the chapter reading that you're doing with your textbook, is the best way to prepare for those quizzes and tests. So if you have any questions, please send me an email. I'm also going to set up a discussion forum so that we can exchange questions and answers, such that if you have a question about the textbook or really any facet of the course, you can post your question to the discussion forum, and I'll answer it. That way everybody in the class will benefit from that exchange. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started with Chapter 1, a first look at computer parts and tools. So the objectives for this chapter. So this chapter is going to introduce desktops, laptops, mobile devices, and tools. It is a high-level overview, meaning that it's a mile wide and an inch deep. Throughout the rest of this course, we do have 20 chapters in all to cover. We'll have more time to drill down into these individual components or individual topics. So this is really meant to be a brief introduction. And you may want to take notes for future reference, but I think a lot of this, for most of you at least, will be review. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So objectives: identify the various parts inside a desktop computer case and describe how they are connected together and compatible. Also, identify the various ports, slots, and internal components of a laptop computer and explain special concerns when supporting and maintaining laptops. And as you can probably imagine, the different form factor between a desktop or tower PC is significantly different than that of a mobile device or a laptop. In fact, for other portable devices, since tablets are mentioned quite frequently, I can tell you that a lot of manufacturers seal their tablets so that you can't work on them. So if you have an extended warranty on such a device with some manufacturers, that device, if you send it in for repair, what they'll actually do is throw it away and send you a new one. So there's really not a lot that you can do on those devices anyway, but since they're permanently sealed, that eliminates any possibility that you might be able to swap out any parts. But PCs and laptops are different. They are generally much more expensive machines, and simply by virtue of the different form factors that they have, lend themselves more easily to the maintenance and repair. All right, continuing with the objectives, describe various hardware components in mobile devices and types of wired and wireless connections mobile devices can make. So we'll get into this chapter a very brief discussion about networking. So wireless networking is quickly becoming the de facto standard for even enterprise installations. There are many reasons for that trend, and we'll probably talk about that a little later in the course. Next bullet point here, describe the purpose of various tools you will need as a computer hardware technician. And even if you're not a computer hardware technician, it's a good idea to have some of the tools that we will look at if you maintain any of your own equipment. Those would include things like a spudger, which looks a lot like a pencil, but it has a chisel end on one end and a pencil point on the other, and it's used for prying computer cases open. It's also non-metallic, so it won't conduct electricity. Another good tool to have, and there are many, but an anti-static mat. It's considered a best practice if you are opening up a computer case of any sort that you be properly grounded so that you don't damage any of the components inside through static electricity. But again, we'll get into that a little later in this course. So, what's inside the case? Well, for both form factors, again, we're talking here primarily of laptops and PCs. What's inside the case is, well, everything. So power supply, motherboard, processor, memory modules, everything that makes your PC a PC is housed within that case. The tower form factor is probably one of the more popular types of cases these days, and it's not hard to see why. The tower affords you all sorts of flexibility to change out power supplies and or add components to upgrade your PC, etc. So that extra room, it makes it very easy to be a do-it-yourselfer with a lot of PC brands. Laptops are a completely different animal. And you know, so are the other types of form factors listed here. So tower case sits upright. I would bet that most of you, if you have a PC at home, I'm going to bet that you probably have a tower model. The desktop case lies flat and is sort of the traditional PC model. That would be a desktop unit laying flat with the monitor sitting on top. Mobile cases and all-in-one, right? Mobile refers to laptops and tablets. And as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, some tablets aren't even meant to, or designed to be fixed. In the case that they're broken, they're simply replaced. There's not enough margin in the device to warrant an expensive repair, so it's quite simply cheaper to send you a new one in the event of damage. And all-in-one cases, you know, those are often touch screens, usually pretty large, and so there's enough of an investment in those types of devices to warrant additional repair and or upgrade. I will say that those are not really common unless you count kiosks into that same category. If that's the case, you know, touchscreens and kiosks are pretty common. And again, I'll remind you that I work for Lenovo Corporation, which is the largest PC manufacturer in the world. So I get to see a lot of these numbers and see where our company ranks against them on a periodic basis. So I will say that the demise of the PC has been forecast many times over the years, but this pandemic has shown that it still has holding power, and PCs are actually selling pretty briskly right now, PCs and laptops. So all these people stuck at home for work and school need some sort of way to connect to others and to work and school, and so there's really no other substitute for these mobile devices. So next slide. So these next few slides are going to show pictures of various types of ports and connectors. Some of these I would consider to be legacy and are there for reference only. And some of them are probably good to know for future reference, as in you might find them on a test. So let's take a look at this first image here with the 15-pin D-shell connector. Now I'll draw your attention to the shape of the actual connector. If you look at the blue portion of the adapter where the female pinouts are, the shell that's surrounding it, if you were to rotate this up so that it was standing on its edge, the shell around this blue would roughly resemble a shell. So that's why you often hear this and other similar connectors referenced as a D-shell plug. This particular one is a DB15, which, you guessed it, means that there are 15 pinouts or 15 holes on this particular connector. So you'll find that these adapters aren't in wide use anymore. Many of these serial type of connectors have been replaced with USB cables, firewire cables, HDMI cables, and the like. So if you've got an older PC, you might find that they're still available. But again, they're better methods for providing this sort of connectivity now. Same thing applies to the S port in the second picture. I would also classify that as a legacy port, meaning that the round video port or that this is used to support, like televisions, is often supplanted now by using an HDMI cable. You will still find some devices that use this, but again, the more common device is the universal HDMI cable, right? And we won't go through each one of these except to say that I think it's important that you at least spend a little time going through these on your own. Again, I'll point out that many of these are legacy devices. So if you'll follow my mouse for just a moment, this connector here, right, this would belong to a PC at least a generation back. The type of connectors that they have listed here or shown here were retired many years ago. It makes me think of this is an old device, but an IBM PC Junior was one of the first PCs that was built for the academic market, so it was aimed at students. And they were pretty record-breaking at the time in that they had several rather, features that were considered consumer-friendly. For example, if you notice these plugs here, they're color-coded, and the ports are color-coded, and the wires that plug into them are also color-coded. So if you're a student at home assembling a PC, then it was easy for you to understand quickly where to plug the cables. Now that may not sound like a big deal now, but at the time that this was introduced, PCs were still relatively rare, and the IT types that might be using this type of equipment would usually be well versed in the hardware that was required to assemble it. But as PCs moved into outside of the data center, outside of corporate America, and became more mainstream, companies like IBM looked for ways to make their setup more user-friendly. And this is just one example. So again, on the back of a modern PC, if you were to buy one today, you'd find a completely different setup than the one here with the color-coded ports. So I do recommend that you take some time to review this slide. It is good testable material, but again, many of these ports have been retired. It has long since been retired because there are better ways to connect your PC to your printer. In an enterprise environment, it's likely to be that you're printing over a LAN and you've got a shared network printer. If you're printing at home, it's also possible that you're printing wirelessly, since we also all have so many mobile devices in the home. And finally, the ports on this page, we notice we have two. The one on the left is for a networking cable, this very bottom port here, the bigger of the two, and that's called an RJ45 plug. That stands for Registered Jack 45, and it is used exclusively for network communications. The plug to the right of that, the smaller plug here, is an RJ11, and that was first used and is still used for telephone connections. So if you had a modem, for example, that you were plugging into a PC, you would use that particular port. It's highly unlikely that you would find anything like that in a modern PC. But at least the RJ11 port, those have been retired. If you do need a modem, then it's likely that you would add a PCI card to your PC and use that instead of relying on a built-in port. RJ45 ports are still very much in use, and you can have both onboard, in other words, they're built into the motherboard, or you can have separate PCI cards. So if you have any questions about that, please let me know. I think those are probably pretty straightforward. Again, the bottom plug there, that RJ45, is probably the only one you're likely to encounter on a new or late model PC. So here we have a schematic of a tower PC, which shows some of the major components, including the power supply, optical drive, power cords, etc. And you'll notice that there is a lot of space in here, and that the motherboard is actually pretty small. That's not an uncommon feature. that you've got slots in the rear, for example, that are for a much larger motherboard. So you might look at the back of this case and say, wow, I've got all sorts of PCI slots available, only to open up the PC and find that you've got a much smaller footprint. Uh, this type of motherboard again is very common, as is this arrangement, as it gives the maximum amount of flexibility to the person, to the administrators, or whoever owns this PC. You can add devices at will. There are additional power dongles that are coming out of the power supply. The power supply, while not hot swap, is still easily swappable. So it's one of the few components that you might actually be able to run down to Best Buy and get. That would be in combination with your power supply and your DIMMs, right? Some of the other hardware found in here, such as the CPU heatsink, the fan that's attached to that, et cetera, may have to come from the manufacturer or a more specialized retailer. So if you've not had the opportunity to put your hands on some hardware and actually open a computer case, I think it's an important part of your technical education to do so. Even if you're, say, working with virtual machines and spend a lot of time thinking about memory and vCPUs and networks and the like, understanding how this hardware works at a fundamental level can apply to many other appliances. Servers are a good example, but beyond that, looking at switches and routers and firewalls, in essence, those devices, although they're dedicated networking devices, are really only specialized computers and have many of the same components that we have listed here. So, although we don't have the opportunity in this course because we're remote to look inside of a PC case, if you have the opportunity to do so because you have some old hardware at home, then I think that it would behoove you to take the time to open it up to see what you have. If you need an excuse to do so, again, if you have an old PC at home, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that it's probably dusty. So that could be a good weekend project for you, where you open up your PC, buy a can of compressed air, and blow out all the dust. I would highly recommend that if you're going to do something like that you do it outside. Also, it's not a good idea to use a vacuum in close proximity to the PC. Because the vacuum can generate an electric charge, and even if you don't feel the discharge, you can cause damage to other components. So resist the urge to use a vacuum around the PCs and for that matter laptops in favor of compressed air. One exception to that would be if you've got a low power handheld battery operated vacuum, perhaps one with a small brush like you might use to clean a keyboard. That's probably safe for use around a PC or a laptop that's open, but you certainly don't want to use a vacuum cleaner that you would use otherwise to, say, clean your floors or to a shop vac. Much too powerful and can generate a sizable electric charge. Okay, continuing, what's in the case? The motherboard is also known as a system board. It is the largest single IC board, integrated circuit board, in your PC. Again, if we go back to the previous slide, you can see that, well, we'll stick with this slide. If you look at this particular one, this is another view of a motherboard. This substrate here is what supports all these other peripherals. Again, I will say that what you're looking at here is an old motherboard design for a number of reasons. One of which is the audio complex that you see here with all these color-coded ports. You've got USB ports built in, you've got HDMI, you've got a lot of hardware that's built into the back, or a lot of ports that are built into the back of the PC. And generally speaking, hardware manufacturers are moving away from putting all those ports on a motherboard, because if any one of these ports breaks, right, you've got to replace the entire motherboard. By contrast, if you have them set up on a separate card, the network card is a really good example of that. If you've got your network cards separate, in other words, they're PCI cards, then you can easily replace the PCI card in the event that you suffer some sort of damage or failure of the card. By contrast, in this example, if you have any trouble with your RJ45 plug, your only option to recover that plug is to replace the entire motherboard. So that can, of course, threaten the operation and the continued use of the entire PC. So expansion cards, are an important part of keeping your PCs modular and are very easy to upgrade, very easy to replace in the event that they become damaged. So it does say here today most ports are provided by motherboards. Again, I would disagree with that statement. Many of these ports are being retired in favor of high-speed USB and or HDMI ports. And especially on a server, you would not see anything like that 6 audio port cluster that you see there on the right. Now that's something that's reserved strictly for, or once upon a time at least, was reserved strictly for home PCs. So continuing our review, all right, here are the memory modules, otherwise known as DIMM modules, and the pairing is important with the installation of those DIMM modules because they have different speeds, they have different capacities, and you want to make sure that you are matching your DIMMs. There are also different channels, so that you might have to install DIMMs in pairs. So before you start buying any DIMMs to either replace or upgrade the memory in your PC or your laptop, please take a look at the owner's manual and see if there are any capacities or pairing requirements before you go out and buy the new components. Memory is fairly cheap, but no need to buy additional hardware if it's not going to work for your chassis. Even if your PC, if it's an older model and you can upgrade to the latest DIMM module, something very fast, for example, much larger than you have currently, it may be larger than what your PC can access. So you might, even though it has the right form factor for the DIMM socket, it may not actually be accessible by the hardware. So again, please consult your PC manual before you buy any new hardware. It may not be compatible with your particular configuration. So continuing on, hard drives and other devices. I'll direct your attention in this slide to the middle device. That is an SSD. And an SSD is rapidly becoming the storage medium of choice for a number of reasons. Number one reason is speed. And as cost continues to drop for SSDs, meaning that they're becoming much more cost effective, then you can depend on seeing SSDs continue to replace all mechanical drives in the not so distant future. That's already happening in the enterprise, in data centers and large installations. SSDs are rapidly replacing mechanical drives, and for a variety of reasons. Certainly they're not perfect, but SSDs do offer a number of improvements over mechanical drives. For example, they are almost shock-proof. I say almost because I hesitate to say it is completely shock-proof, but it is one of the demonstrations that we like to do at Lenovo, and this was when SSDs were first becoming common, is to take a laptop into a classroom or to a presentation and drop it from about 4 feet onto the floor. And provided nothing else broke, right, your PC would continue running, which was at the time just amazing because mechanical drives, if you were to repeat the same exercise to drop a laptop 4 feet to a hard floor, would damage the hard drives or cause the machine to fail, right? Get a blue screen of death or something similar. So SSDs were a good answer to mobile devices that typically have a lot more shock than PCs and certainly servers. So the optical drive here and the standard hard drive, although you can find them in certain systems, DVDs are going the way of CDs because there are lots of other storage options available these days. And cloud computing even plays a role in the demise of that physical media. Power supply, also known as a PSU, pretty self-explanatory. It's what powers your PC. Now, it's interesting to note that your PC, although you plug it into the wall, is actually a DC powered appliance. And that's what your power supply does. It takes your alternating current from the wall and converts it to DC power for all the components inside your case. And that's why, frankly, your power supply will get hot when it's plugged in, right? Because it's converting that energy from AC to DC. If you're running straight from battery power, then it would not be as hot because it doesn't have to go through that conversion. But all PCs and servers for that matter are set up in the same way. So power supplies do not have, it's worth noting, any user serviceable parts inside. So you should never, under any circumstances, open up a power supply to do any troubleshooting or try to replace any components. There are large capacitors in many power supplies that, if mishandled, can cause a really serious shock up to or including death. So there's really no reason whatsoever for you to ever try to open up a power supply. Power supplies should be replaced in their entirety, and your used power supply should be recycled. So please consult your local solid works department to see where you can dispose of computer and e-waste safely. A disposed of or old power supply can hold a charge for a considerable time, and you do need to make sure that you take proper care in disposing of it. It says here too that most come with a dual voltage selector switch, so that you can switch between 115 volts and 220. Well, in the U.S., that's almost always going to be on a 115 volt circuit. It's very rare that you would have a 220 volt circuit. Maybe you will have a few pockets in Canada that might use that in North America. So other than that, the 220 volt service or switch would really only be used outside of the U.S. So if you find yourself in Europe or EMEA, you might find the opportunity to switch that. But also, it's worth noting that many new power supplies have built-in switching. So it takes the responsibility out of your hands to determine which voltage level you need. You'd simply plug the PC in, and the power supply would sense the current that's available and make the appropriate switch. Form factors used by computer cases, power supplies, and motherboards. So this is good test material, I'll say that, and we'll go ahead and jump through these next slides pretty quickly. ATX was one of the earliest motherboard forms, and it's a we'll call it the large form factor motherboard. The large PCs are really not popular these days. Most people want to have a small footprint on their desktop. And in fact, the preferred device these days is a laptop for obvious reasons. We also make a device at Lenovo that's called a Tiny. Dell and HP also have similar products, but a Tiny, as the name would suggest, is a PC that's about the size of a paperback novel and is designed to mount to the back of a monitor. So, that form factor obviously is not part of our review here, but I bring it up just to alert you to the fact that PCs come in all different shapes, all different sizes, and some of them are pretty specialized. Okay, continuing our review here, right? ATX, mini ATX that was mentioned on the previous slide here. You notice that the ATX is getting pretty long in the tooth. It was originally developed by Intel in 1995, right? So 25 years ago. Again, it's a pretty solid design, so you'll still see this particular form factor used. It's interesting to note that a lot of the hardware that's used by companies like HP and Dell and Asus and Lenovo and others are actually built by the same companies. So Foxconn is a really good example. It's also interesting to note that motherboard design is very complex, and your motherboard may have many layers to it, which means that as motherboard designs change, a lot of the change happens on the periphery of the board, and it's not hard to understand why. If you think about your motherboard like you would a city, if you decide to put a brand new building in the middle of a populated city, that takes a lot of work, right? You might already have buildings where you intend to put the new one. You may already have, electrical and gas and sewer lines that are also, again, where you look to put your new building. Those would need to be rerouted. So many times the growth that you see in a city mimics that you see in a motherboard. So in such an example, if I was wanting to add, let's say, an additional chipset to a motherboard, and I'm a motherboard designer, I would likely add those chipsets on the edges of the motherboard because it's free real estate, right? So just like in a city where the edges of town are those that are most likely to experience periods of growth, motherboards are actually the same way. And like I said, it's not hard to understand why, because if you're implementing new components, it's a lot easier to put those on the edge rather than trying to stick them in the middle of a design that's already been tested and in the field for some time. So something to keep in mind as you're looking at various motherboard designs. So next slide. Continuing with our review, a 21P1 connector is one style connector that can be used to plug a power supply into the motherboard. Again, this is something that you will, it's a very large plug, hard to mistake. It's also usually very close to the power supply itself. So the large 20-pin connector or 24-pin connector is probably pretty stubby. The other power supply dongles that would come out of a power supply are longer because they need to service components all over, potentially all over the chassis, and need to be able to stretch that. So if you add a new hard drive or add a new optical drive, you need to be able to supply it with power. So having those longer dongles makes a lot of sense. So if you are opening your PC and you see that you have a bunch of unused plugs, that's fine. What those are there for is future expansion. And frankly, it's one of the benefits that you have with using an ATX motherboard or a full-sized PC case. Okay. We're continuing the review with form factors here. So here is the micro ATX. Again, it's a much smaller motherboard. Actually, the very first image that we looked at that showed the side panel of the PC removed was a micro ATX form factor. It's got a lot of the same capability that the full-size ATX board does. The primary difference is that you don't have the same number of expansion slots. And that's really the give as you use smaller and smaller motherboards. You are sacrificing that small footprint for expandability and configurability. So with the smaller the motherboard, the less likely that you'll have additional expansion slots. In fact, you might not have any as you continue to get smaller. So it's certainly a trade-off, but form factor is important and is probably driven by the space and or unique needs that you have for your particular PC. So, all right, here is an example of a micro ATX motherboard, and you notice that in this case on the right-hand side there, you've got 3 PCI slots. You would have 3 more, maybe even more on an ATX motherboard. Also, again, just to highlight the fact that this is some dated material, that beige-looking squarish port that you see on the left side of the motherboard, that's actually where the CPU goes. And that particular type of slot is called a ZIF socket, Zero Insertion Force socket, which is actually an old design. So again, not to belabor the point, but yeah, some of this material is dated. And the SAS drive would be reserved for high-speed devices. In both types of drives, there are platters that are spinning at very high speed, and the faster that platter is spinning, the higher speed, the faster your data can be delivered. So the faster drives are typically running anywhere between 10 and 15,000 RPMs, which again is very fast for a mechanical drive, but the SSDs are still many times faster. And it's easy to understand why that would be. One of the nicest features that in the laptop that I'm working on for this very presentation does have an SSD, and one of the many benefits that affords me is that my laptop, when I open it up, and yours is probably much the same way too, when I turn it on, it starts very, very quickly. If it's in a sleep state, it's almost instant when I turn it on. So that is a very nice feature. Also, as I mentioned previously, it's impervious to shocks or drops, and it offers really fast I/O, so read and write capabilities. The one drawback from SSDs still continues to be price, although they are coming down significantly. They're still generally more expensive than their mechanical counterparts. The other drawback to SSDs is that they don't fail as gracefully. Mechanical hard drives, we understand those very well because we've been building those for decades. But the SSDs are relatively new, and as such, we're still learning about them in terms of their longevity. Again, their failure rates, because they really are in many ways a big DIMM, right? It's just a solid state device. They don't fail predictably, right? You can have a hard drive that has a catastrophic and sudden failure, and SSDs and SATA and PATA drives generally don't respond that way. So here we have a look at one example of a a laptop. And again, all the ports are, it used to be that you might have ports out the back, but those have moved along to the side for many reasons, right? Not the least of which is hinge design. And many of the ports that they're showing in this particular example, may not be there. You may have only one or two USB ports. You may not have a VGA port at all. You may have an SD card reader or not. Many manufacturers are turning to a universal port that attaches to a dongle, and that dongle can be used to attach to any manner of peripheral ports. But instead of having all these specialized ports here, an Ethernet port, a VGA port, an SD card slot, etc., having a universal dongle port that can then connect to a lot of these devices is a lot easier to manufacture. Plus, in terms of profitability for the PC, you probably already know this, but there's not a lot of profit margin in PCs or laptops. And many times the computer manufacturer is making more money by selling you a dongle that attaches to it or a docking station that attaches to it than it's making selling the actual laptop. So anyway, I'd say this is especially true with optical drives. Most modern laptops do not come with an optical drive. Again, you might be able to connect one via USB or some other cabling system, but in the main, they take up too much real estate, right? They're simply too big for the small form factor laptop computers. So ports common to laptops: USB, FireWire, network, dial-up modem, not so much anymore. Audio, not so much anymore. Video ports, not so much anymore. You might find those on older designs, but again, what you're more likely to find these days are USB, FireWire, maybe network. It's unusual to find an RJ11 plug, which would be your modem plug. And then the audio and the video ports, right? Those are going to be in the form of HDMI cables predominantly. Most laptops include slots for flash memory cards, and there are a variety of devices that use those now. So, GoPro is a good example, but of course there are many other digital cameras that use those SD card devices, and so you will find that is pretty common with most new PCs. When a laptop is missing a port or a slot, you can use a USB dongle. So again, that's just like I was mentioning on the previous slide. Many manufacturers are moving to dongles because they can make more money on the dongle than they can on selling the PC itself. You know, USB cables are a great example. I'm sorry, HDMI cables are a great example of this. If you bought an HDMI cable lately, gone down to Best Buy or a similar store, and I don't mean to pick on Best Buy specifically, but if you buy an HDMI cable at a retail outlet, you might be surprised to see prices of, $30, $40, or $50 or more, right? Well, that cable, for the most part, costs $10 or less to the vendor. So there's a huge markup in HDMI cables. So again, it allows them to recoup some of their profits from low margin devices like laptops, tablets, and PCs. Here's an example of a USB dongle. This one is being used to provide network connection on the left, and then on the right, the USB port is using to add Wi-Fi. Probably don't need to reinforce the idea that this is pretty dated material, but if you have a laptop that uses this sort of device, well, great. But again, if you've bought a PC in the last 3 to 5 years, this probably is not common to you. You need to go back at least a generation or two before you see things like these devices being widely used. Again, I'll be posting this information to the website in terms of of these PowerPoint slides. I do recommend that you review this material in combination with reading your textbook, but I won't go over each one of these here because I'm hoping that most of this is already common knowledge. Right? Express card slots. Again, this is an old technology. The PCM-CIA was a credit card size device that would plug directly into a slot attached to the motherboard for laptops. And the PCM-CIA slots offered lots of expansion capabilities. One very common option in a PCM-CIA card was a modem. So again, modem use not very common these days. We're much more likely to be using wireless networks or perhaps even cellular networks on your laptop, and not using PCM-CIA for dial-up. Okay, continuing with express card slots, again, it's considered to be an older technology, so I won't belabor the point here. Docking stations. So a docking station, if you happen to be working in a corporate environment, chances are that your primary workstation, quote unquote, is a laptop. And as you go to meetings and move about your building or campus, you take that laptop with you everywhere. If you should have an assigned seat, however, you might have things like perhaps a printer or speakers or dual monitors or any number of peripherals attached to it. So a docking station provides a convenient way for you to plug your laptop into the docking station, and the docking station will in turn be plugged into all these other devices. So it allows you to, I'll make up a number, it allows you to plug in one cable as opposed to plugging in, 5 or 6 cables. And it does reduce wear and tear on those other ports by having the single port. And also, if you remember what I said about docking stations a few minutes ago, it's often the case that companies like HP, Dell, certainly Lenovo, that we make more money selling the docking station than we do selling the PC. So there is a fair bit of markup in that hardware. But I will say that docking stations are nice since we're on the topic. They do make life a little easier if you find that you are, again, in a corporate environment on the move a lot. Going back to your desk or your office and plugging into a docking station is convenient, especially if you've got multiple monitors to attach to. this makes your life much more effortless in terms of your computing environment. So, laptop internal components. So, for all but for most components, I'll say it's probably a good idea not to open your laptop, right? You may be able to service a few items, but the tolerances are so tight on most laptops that it can be very, very difficult to effect a reliable repair. So if you've broken a hinge screen, or if you want to replace a network card, or certainly the CPU, best to leave that to the professionals, right? You might need to send that in, or take it to a third party. If you are doing something more simple, perhaps changing out the DIMMs, which we would call a SODIMM in the case of a laptop, or a hard drive, right? Those are relatively simple operations that if you have a pretty good PC IQ, that you can likely do on your own. Beyond that, however, certainly doing things like even replacing the backlight on an LCD screen can be fairly tricky. Not that you can't do it, but the tolerances in a laptop are so tight, and there's not a lot of give and take for many of the wiring harnesses that are installed. It really can be a big challenge to get everything in the proper place and stay there when you're working with such a small or compact device. So again, I would say if you're doing your memory or your hard disk, those are things that you can replace on your own, as shown in this diagram here. But for anything else beyond that, it's probably best to leave that to a qualified technician. So, laptop internal components, pretty much everything that you'd find inside of a PC, with the exception of a battery pack, because it has all the same needs, right? It is a portable PC after all, so you would need all the same components, which would include what's listed here: hard drives, maybe one or maybe plural, CPU, heatsink, and fan, memory, wireless card, system board, obviously, an optical drive, which again is likely to be connected via dongle. But it is in fact, a portable PC, so not surprising there are lots of common parts here. What's in an all-in-one? Well, the special thing about an all-in-one is really its design. It's otherwise just a different form factor for your PC. So just like we saw with the laptop in the previous slide, everything in an all-in-one is the same thing that you find in a regular PC. Now, an all-in-one will depend on touchscreen technology, and you may have additional space inside the chassis to add additional components, or to make other configuration changes, simply by virtue of having a larger box. But the primary advantage to having an all-in-one computer is that typically you have a very large touchscreen environment. So if you're somebody that enjoys being able to work with your hands more or less in a computing environment, then an all-in-one computer may be a good option for you. Maintaining laptops and mobile devices. I can shortcut through a lot of this information to say that maintaining laptops and mobile devices has a lot to do with, number one, not dropping them or subjecting them to shocks and drops. Number two, thermal stability. So, for example, it's really not a good idea to leave your laptop or mobile device in your car. That applies to the summer. That also applies to the winter. If your device gets really hot or cold and then comes into a temperature controlled space, it can cause problems with condensation, which can create all sorts of problems. If you happen to leave, for example, your laptop in your car on a winter day or overnight and it's below freezing, it's a good idea to be on the safe side to let your PC sit for several hours to become acclimated to the indoor space before turning it on. Once the laptop is powered on, those components heat up pretty rapidly, And it is possible to, if they heat up too quickly, that some of the internal components can be damaged. That's simply from rapid warming. Again, the other problem is condensation. If the components inside of your PC attract moisture, again, that can cause any number of problems. So, best idea is to not subject your PC or your laptop to temperature extremes. Try to keep them in a temperature-controlled environment as much as possible. Don't drop them, and make sure that you do some sort of annual cleaning regarding the cooling system. Dust is the enemy of all PCs, servers, laptops, and other devices, and it can be pretty sticky. So blowing the dust out, again, buying a can of compressed air and removing that dust buildup can be very important to extending the life of your devices. The dust will do things like, we'll use laptops as an example. As dust builds up on those fans, not only does it reduce the air throughput because it's just clogged with dust, but it also reduces the RPMs of the fan. So it's a double whammy in that the fan isn't spinning as quickly as it would if it were clean, plus it's not moving as much air through it. So it's very important that you keep those clean. The dust can build up to such a point that it causes the fans to stop working, and when the fan stops working, that can ultimately damage other components in your box, not the least of which is your CPU. In the couple of the slides we've already seen tonight, we've seen CPU fans that were mounted directly to the heatsink on the CPU. And if they do stop working, and there is a high concentration of dust in the box, the CPU can actually burn itself up, become so hot that it becomes damaged. So making sure that your PC can cool itself efficiently and effectively is a very, very important part of properly maintaining your laptops and other mobile devices. Right. Continuing on this note, right, keep notebook at room temperature, keep away from smoke, water, dust. I think most of these would fall under the common sense rules, right? Do not run with it. Protect it against ESD, right? Especially important in colder climates where or colder months when it's easier to build up a static charge, right? It's important that you also take care of not only the device itself, but of course what you really care about is the data that you have on that device. So part of your, we'll call it disaster recovery plan, right? Part of your disaster recovery plan and proper maintenance should and must include some sort of proper backup. Cleaning tips: clean LCD panel with a soft, dry cloth. There are specialized cleaners available that will help you, that will allow you to clean your screens, your touch screens, and other device contact surfaces safely. Some solvents can actually damage the coatings that are on those devices. I would not use Windex, for example. If you do have a dirty screen for one of these touch screens devices, then getting a damp cloth and wiping it down with a damp cloth is probably going to be as effective as anything else. There are a number of reasons why you don't want to use other cleaners. I already mentioned one, in that it can actually physically damage the screen, and it can do this in a number of ways. The properties of the chemicals, the solvents, can actually cause the contact surfaces to become distorted. I hate to, this sounds worse than it is, but it could actually sort of melt it. Much like if you pour fingernail polish remover onto plastic, it can cause the plastic to become distorted. The other one is that if you spray, think of a bottle of Windex, for example, if you spray it on your laptop screen, if you overspray, the runoff is going to go down inside the laptop screen, inside the frame, and that can cause, could cause an immediate problem, but it could also lead to causing intermittent problems in the future. So that excess cleaning fluid running down your laptop screen into the bezel is definitely hazardous. So compressed air, we've already talked about. If you want to think of 2 times a year to clean your laptops, right, it might be when you change your clock. So spring forward and fall back. So when we exit daylight savings time in the fall and resume daylight savings time in the spring, those are pretty good indications to it's a good time to inspect your laptop or other devices and make a point of cleaning it. Again, taking compressed air to it, blowing it out, perhaps even if it's not obvious that it needs it, just to make sure that it stays in optimal shape. All right. First look at mobile device hardware. So I am glad that they mentioned a smartphone here, because a smartphone, I think that a smartphone really should be called a portable PC, because that's what it is, right? We can do almost everything on our smartphone now that we used to do on PCs and more. A phone is just one of the many apps that are included in a smartphone. So again, you want to make sure that you take good care of that device by doing much of the same thing that you would do, or taking the same precautions that you would with other sensitive devices like your laptop. Don't drop it. Try to keep it in a temperature stable environment, etc., etc. So it deserves the same sort of care and feeding. Now, fortunately, with the smartphone, you can buy cases and screen protectors that will extend the life of your hardware, and I highly recommend that you do that. With cell phone prices for some of the high-end devices reaching $1,000 or more, these devices can be very, very expensive to replace. So proper maintenance and care is very important, right? So first look at mobile device hardware, continuing with tablets. Now again, in this space, tablets and phones are sort of merging together. Microsoft and Samsung both have introduced phones in the last year that are foldable. So it's hard to tell if it's a tablet or if it's a phone, which has coined the term phablet, right? So it's actually both. If you've seen the new Microsoft phone, which runs about $1,400, it's a foldable tablet, but unlike the Samsung device, the phone that debuted, was it earlier this year? I want to say it was the March time frame. That the Microsoft device is actually two separate screens separated by a hinge, whereas the Samsung device is actually a full screen. The screen itself folds, which is one of the reasons why it ran into so many problems and they had to temporarily pull or stop production. But anyway, you can expect this is going to be a continued area for research. Phones are changing. Everybody from Apple to Microsoft and Nokia and BlackBerry even is looking for a way to develop the next killer device. So we are doing more and more on our smartphones. So it makes sense that developers and engineers would be looking for ways to allow us to have a larger viewing experience. So other mobile devices, e-readers, right? We see those at the likes of Barnes and Noble, certainly Best Buy. Smart cameras, wearable technologies, so Fitbit certainly fits here. Smartwatches in terms of Apple. Increasingly these wearable technology devices, biometric we'll call them, can be used in a corporate environment for having multiple factor, 2 or 3 factor authentication. So wearable technology is another area, just like the building of larger phones. Wearable technology is another area that's receiving a lot of attention from automobile manufacturers and home security companies and telephone companies alike. So everybody's trying to find a good form factor to have, to try to build the next killer hardware platform. Connection types. So some ways a mobile device connects to the outside world. Wi-Fi is pretty common. Wi-Fi and cellular are easily the top two, but smartphones travel with us all the time. We can use Bluetooth and infrared, principally Bluetooth, to connect to our cars and other devices. We might use NFC, for reading inventory tags. It's less common to have a wired connection for mobile devices, and I guess I'm really thinking phones here, but if you include laptops with your mobile devices, then that perhaps is more common. Tethering and mobile hotspots, again, very common with smartphones these days, so that you can turn your phone into a hotspot and then connect wirelessly via your laptop. That's a pretty common paradigm these days and likely to become more so. So a mobile device can use the following to sense position. So it has a gyroscope or accelerometer, as well as using GPS, right? So this is pretty sophisticated. The being able to run Google Maps or Waze when you're driving home to see what the traffic conditions are like. It uses both of these to help understand where you are, and also understand what sort of road hazards in the case of Google Maps or Waze, to help you take a different route if necessary. But I think most of us are starting to take this sort of technology for granted when just a generation ago, right, the sort of information that's available to us on our laptop wasn't available even to companies like, or sorry, individuals like the military, right? They could get this sort of information, but it certainly wasn't portable and it wasn't accessible in a way that it is now. So you have military grade hardware, most of you do, in your pocket right now in the form of your smartphone. So storage devices, there are many options. Increasingly, the cloud is being pushed as the preferred storage option. It's still relatively expensive and can be time consuming to upload and or download your data. So flash memory in the form of a solid state device like we see the slot here. In addition, USB drives are also very common. There are lots of different form factors available for SSD devices. For example, a GoPro uses a micro SD card for which you need a converter that would accept the larger device, the larger shell, if you will, to plug in the port that's pictured here. Increasingly, though, Bluetooth and other wireless technologies can also be used to transmit and store information. Pictures and videos and the like. So as these devices become more, and I'm talking specifically here about mobile devices, as they become more capable and more dense in terms of storage capacities, right? At some point, we're going to reach a limit. And streaming services, networking services stand poised to fill that breach, right? So if you are using Google Photos, for example, if you have that synced to your smartphone, then you're already enjoying some of the advantages of that, in that when you take a picture, your pictures are automatically uploaded to your Google Photos account, which can be pretty handy. But again, it points out the continuing need for these storage and, for that matter, power-hungry devices. It's something that will receive much attention in the years ahead, because as our devices become more sophisticated, we'll need to find ways to provide them with additional memory capabilities. So look for more movement in this area. Mobile device accessories, right? No surprise here, any of it. So I won't really cover much here, not much to add. Again, I'll point out docking stations because I want to make sure that's a term you're familiar with in the event that you've not used one before. Credit card readers also very common, in the gig economy. Drivers of Lyft and Uber, for example, often use their cell phones, or rather do use their cell phones to accept payment from riders. And these other devices are common not just to smartphones, but also to laptops. So having external speakers, a wireless keyboard for a particularly small device, et cetera, right? All these things can be very useful to improving the user experience. My son, for example, is a middle school student, and he has an iPad, but prefers to use the wireless keyboard with it, simply because it's a lot easier to try to type on a real keyboard than to type on the screen displayed keyboard inside the iPad. So likely you've run into many situations like that as well. Field serviceable parts for mobile devices, FRU. If you remember my comments earlier about power supplies, right? The power supply would be an example of something that's not field serviceable. There are very few components inside of a mobile device that would be considered field serviceable. So we talked about a couple of those already, and that would be hard drives and memory primarily. There may be others, for example, batteries are pretty modular on some laptops, not all. For example, on the laptop that I'm using now, which is about 2 years old, it is a Lenovo T480E. It has an internal battery, so I'm not able to swap batteries to either upgrade the battery time or to replace this particular one when it becomes a little older. If when it reaches the end of its serviceable life, I will have a choice as to whether or not I should extend the battery or not. Typically what happens with a lot of these older PCs and laptops is the battery becomes so unstable that, so weak that you have to leave it plugged in all of the time, which rather defeats the whole idea of being a portable device. But batteries do have a limited lifespan, and at some point all the batteries will need to be replaced or upgraded. Tools used by computer technicians. So there are many, and there are lots of toolkits that you can buy that will include all of these items. If you are a do-it-yourselfer, or even if you're not, if you're looking to become one so that you can get more experience with computer hardware, there's several inexpensive toolkits that you can purchase that would include all of this hardware. So I recommend that you go to something like a Newegg, certainly Amazon, and look for a computer hardware bundle, right? Or computer technician bundle. Look for ESD straps and the like, and you will find a wealth of products out there. Here's an example of one such toolkit. So the flashlight and the compressed air can on the left stand out. Some of the others here, perhaps not so obvious, like chips, extractors, tweezers, non-metallic screwdrivers, gloves, anti-static pad, alcohol swabs, zip ties, right? The CDs over on the right, and those RCDs may have firmware updates or other software that needs to be applied. Another item that you have in the bottom right-hand side is a voltmeter, and the voltmeter can be very important to help you troubleshoot an issue. For example, see if a particular component is getting enough power. For example, maybe you have a fan that fails inside of your PC. Well, it may be a good idea before you replace the fan to check to make sure that the socket that it's plugged into is actually receiving enough power. All of the items here, of course, can be purchased as a kit or nearly as a kit, or purchased individually. Post-diagnostic card. So this is similar to the onboard computer scan that you might use in your car. and you would plug this device into a PCI slot in your PC to get an error code, right? So helps discover and report computer errors and conflicts at the post. This is still a common device. This particular one is kind of old. I'll direct your attention to that black square on kind of the right of center here in the graphic. The chassis, or the brown plug that's mounted in, is allows that chip to be removed, right? So that chip could be removed and programmed, and then returned back to this card. And that's a very old style of chip. So again, there are post-diagnostic cards that you can use. This is just one example. If you go and buy one, though, it's likely to look a lot different than this particular example. So firmware is very important. Now, I have a couple of comments about this. Firmware should likely only be updated in the event that you have some sort of direct need. So I would caution you against updating firmware for the sake of updating firmware. It is not a best practice to continually update the firmware on your PC or laptop simply because a new version is available. Now, if there is a security concern, or if there's some other enhancement that's to be had by upgrading to the firmware, then it's a good idea. Now, the reason why it's not a good idea to just update firmware as it becomes available is that you don't know how it's going to impact the other components in your box. So updating to new firmware may fix one problem while simultaneously introducing other problems. So with that, again, I would update firmware with care. And security gets an automatic pass if you're patching something or repairing something that would otherwise be a vulnerability, then that takes precedence. But otherwise, just to replace or to upgrade the firmware because there's a new version can be tricky, especially if you've got a large environment. Let's say, I'll make up a number, you've got 1,000 servers or 1,000 PCs. It's not a trivial thing to go and update the firmware across all of those machines. Power supply test, right? It may be important to test your power supply now, but more than likely, since power supplies can and do fail, if your power supply is not performing up to spec, maybe you're not getting the same sort of voltage out of your power supply that you once did, then it's time to replace it. Again, there are no user serviceable parts inside of a power supply. But maybe a good idea for you to test the outputs before you go and replace one. The good news is that there are many readily available power supply options available to you without having to buy OEM or manufacturer grade power supplies. Typically, the OEM power supplies don't offer as many expansion plugs as third party. Plus, the wattage is usually lower. So by the time you get to the point that you want to replace the power supply in your PC, and the power supply picture here is for, is for a PC. By the time you get to the point that you're ready to replace the power supply, you may be ready to replace the whole computer. But it's also worth noting that power supply tester that is on the left of the screen here, that's plugged into a 20-pin plug that would otherwise plug into your motherboard, and that device is able to read the voltage on each one of the pins in that 20-pin connector. So it is very useful diagnostic information. But at the end of the day, if you suspect that you have a power supply problem, perhaps the fan has stopped working, perhaps you smell a burning smell, perhaps your optical drive stops running, etc., etc., then these are cheap enough that it's probably a good idea, again, if you're not going to replace the whole PC, that you just go ahead and replace the whole power supply. I think it's worth noting that in the not so distant past, right, PCs and for that matter servers were fairly expensive, right? Not to say that they're cheap now, but they were much more expensive than they are right now, and so much of the hardware that's available to us commercially these days is what you would call a vanilla uh, piece of hardware, meaning that you've got a number of vendors that produce a product that are very similar to each other, and as such, that drives the price down. Now you can, the exception to that would be Apple. The other end of that would be something like an Acer or an Asus, right? Those are pretty simple, quote unquote, portable devices, portable laptops, and generally speaking, have a 3-year or perhaps less viable lifespan. Beyond that time, and we're talking about sub $1,000 PCs here. Beyond that time, over 3 years, you're probably going to be better off to replace that hardware or to buy, in other words, buy a new laptop than you will to try to repair your existing one. But anyway, your multimeter is a great way to help you make that decision. You can check the power supply and or the battery. It's just a good all-around versatile tool that you will find uses for outside of your PC lab environment. A loopback plug is a special network plug that is used for networking diagnostics. And the loopback plug is used to make sure that your network port is operating properly. And that's it. So if you put in a loopback plug and then ping that USB, or sorry, that RJ45 port, then pretty quickly things like, is that port, the physical port, working? Is my TCP/IP stack working, right? If you can't plug a loopback adapter, then that points oftentimes points to a physical problem. In other words, the port is physically damaged. But it could also be a software stack thing. So you're probably familiar with the address 127.0.0.1. That is the loopback address, common to all computers and other devices that use TCP/IP. And it can be used in combination with the loopback plug to help you isolate connectivity problems for your laptop or your desktop. So hang on, we've almost made it to the end. So the summary here, again, we've covered a lot of material tonight, and this will be the case for the rest of the course. Hopefully, you are already familiar with most, if not all, of these terms. If not, then, well, you've got a week to review the material and to ask questions. So let me see if there's anything here I need to comment on. Internal laptop components, right? I think that's pretty self-explanatory. It may be easy for you or easy for some of you to get your hands on a PC that you can disassemble. It may be more challenging to get your hands on a laptop that you can disassemble. But if you have a mind to do that, and especially if you're interested in becoming A+ certified at some point, then I would try to look for opportunities that would allow you to disassemble the hardware and get to understand just how all these components work together. So again, continuing the summary here, I'm not going to read these to you because we've already covered these in pretty good detail. But here we are at the an hour and 20 minutes in this video, which is a considerable time. I'll try to cut down future videos to a more manageable level. But there is a lot of content, and this will be common for the rest of the course. So please take the time to review this slide deck on your own and ask any questions. And last slide here, I'll also say, we looked at the computer hardware tools. If you are planning certainly on becoming a technician, you should have your own tools, and that's a modest investment for a lot of the devices that we saw here this evening, which would include not only a can of compressed air, but also special screwdrivers, chip pullers, tweezers, and the like, perhaps zip ties, anti-static bags, isopropyl alcohol with swabs, perhaps a battery-powered vacuum or duster, right? So these are all readily available, very inexpensive devices. And if you have a mind toward working in this field, it'd be a good idea if you go ahead and purchase something like that on your own, so that and to start disassembling some of this hardware, just so that you can become more familiar with all of the components that we will discuss in this chapter and the other 19 that we'll review in this course. So with that, I'll go ahead and close out chapter 1. Thanks for listening this evening. Again, I know this is a lot of information for you to digest, and you have to do so quickly. So please ask any questions, and I wish you good luck. Have a good night.